Okay, let's just dive right in, shall we? When we think of Abram, who we of course later know as Abraham, we almost always picture this towering, totally flawless hero of faith. The guy who gets absolutely everything right. But today's explainer is going to completely deconstruct that image. We're taking a really close look at the events in Genesis chapter 12, and what we actually find is a person on a very messy, highly relatable journey of spiritual growth. He makes these incredible leaps of faith, but he also makes some terrible mistakes. He panics, he relies on his own clever little schemes, and honestly, he fails. And yet, through all of that, his faith fundamentally transforms.
Which brings us to a really crucial question that I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this today. When life's famines hit, and by famines, I don't just mean a literal lack of food. I'm talking about sudden life crises, intense environmental pressures, maybe economic hardships or career failures. When those hit you out of nowhere, do you trust the process and rely on God, or do you totally panic and take matters into your own hands? Keep that tension right at the front of your mind as we look at how Abram handled his own massive crisis.
So to really understand how his faith was forged, we're going to track his journey through three main stages: obedience, weakness, and reconstruction. And then we'll wrap it all up with the Modern Believer Action Guide. Let's get to it.
All right, stage 1. Obedience. Leaving Haran for the absolute unknown. I want you to picture this. You're 75 years old, completely settled, super comfortable, and suddenly you receive a divine calling to just leave everything behind, without a map. Think about the sheer weight of that choice. Abram had to walk away from his local land, his relatives, and his father's house. That was his entire safety net, his identity, his security. Done. Left behind. And in return, God gave him 7 incredible but entirely unseen promises. Things like becoming a great nation, having a great name, and that all families of the earth would literally be blessed through him. God didn't give him the final destination up front. He just gave him a direction. Abram had to step out purely on faith, trusting the voice of God over the comfort of his environment.
And so Abram acts. His physical and spiritual movement into Canaan is actually super fascinating. He leaves Haran at age 75, travels hundreds of kilometers, and arrives at Shechem, right at the Oak of Moreh. Now, the source texts explicitly point out that the Canaanites were already in the land. So this wasn't some peaceful, empty paradise just waiting for him. It was occupied by a very intimidating, powerful people. Talk about an immediate, severe test of faith, right? But how does Abram respond? He builds an altar. Then he moves and he pitches his tent right between Bethel, which translates to house of God, and Ai, which translates to ruin. He is quite literally positioning his life between the house of God and the ruin of the world, purposefully choosing a life of worship and reliance.
But, and this is a big but, here's where the nuance of his journey really comes in. Obeying God's call definitely brought immense blessing, but Abram's obedience was actually only partial. And that partial obedience, it became a very heavy burden. See, he was explicitly commanded to leave his father's house behind, but he chooses to bring his nephew Lot with him. It probably seemed like a totally harmless, maybe even compassionate decision at the time. But Lot didn't just tag along quietly. He later became a massive burden, draining resources and causing major strife between the herdsmen. And even worse, if you look down the historical timeline, Lot's descendants, the Moabites and Ammonites, eventually became bitter rivals to the Israelites. It's just this stark reminder that partial obedience almost always introduces future complications.
Which leads us right into stage 2, weakness, the famine and the flush.
So Abram has been gradually drifting toward the arid south, an area known as the Negev. And right when he's in this totally vulnerable borderland, bam, a severe, life-threatening famine hits the region. His faith basically starts to unravel, and the contrast in his behavior is honestly jarring. Back in Canaan, despite the terrifying presence of the Canaanites, Abram pitched his tents and built altars. He was completely relying on God to protect him. But when the famine hits, he doesn't build an altar to ask God what to do. No, he panics. He heads straight down to Egypt, which structurally represents the secular world here. He goes from a posture of total worship and reliance on God's unseen promises in Canaan to relying entirely on his own fleshly, clever little schemes to try and survive in Egypt.
And that reliance on human cleverness leads straight to this moment of sheer panic and moral failure. Approaching Egypt, Abram actually tells his wife Sarai, "Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake and my life will be spared." Okay, to be fair, she actually was his half-sister, so it was a half-truth. But come on, it was entirely designed as a full lie to save his own skin. The great father of faith basically throws his wife under the bus, sacrificing her safety and purity, all because he stopped seeking God's guidance and just let sheer terror take the wheel.
Now, from a purely worldly economic perspective, Abram's scheme seemed to work flawlessly. I mean, the cost of Egyptian wealth looked like massive profit at first. Pharaoh takes Sarai into his palace and just showers Abram with wealth: sheep, oxen, donkeys, camels, servants. But look closer at what this actually cost him. He gained worldly wealth, yes, including an Egyptian servant named Hagar, but he lost his altar. He completely lost his fellowship and communication with God. And that servant, Hagar, she isn't just a random footnote. She would later become the mother of Ishmael, which severely delayed, complicated, and brought conflict to God's true promise. So worldly success in Egypt looked amazing on paper, but it brought long-term spiritual disaster.
And that brings us to stage 3, reconstruction, finding grace in failure.
Thankfully, the story doesn't just end in the bottom of that valley. The absolutely crucial point we see here is that God steps in to clean up the massive mess Abram made. He protects his promises, even when we spectacularly fail. When Abram was literally too cowardly to protect his own wife, who, remember, was essential to the lineage of the promise, God intervened directly. The text tells us God sends great plagues on Pharaoh and his household. This is the ultimate reconstruction phase. God is actively stepping into human history to protect his redemptive plan, completely despite human weakness. He didn't abandon Abram or cancel the covenant just because Abram had a total failure of faith. But wow, does that divine grace come with a heavy dose of public humiliation? Just listen to Pharaoh's reaction. "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?" Think about the wild irony of this moment. A worldly, pagan king is aggressively rebuking the great father of faith for his total lack of integrity. And in the text, Abram doesn't even have a response to this. He is completely speechless because he knows without a shadow of a doubt that he is entirely in the wrong and he's been caught.
And so as a result, Abram is essentially deported. Pharaoh just kicks him out of Egypt along with his wife and all his newfound wealth. But this really embarrassing exit is actually where the spiritual reconstruction solidifies, because through this massive, very public failure, Abram learns a vital, life-changing lesson. Self-preservation and fleshly human schemes are a total trap. He realizes that God is fully responsible and entirely trustworthy to the very end. God proved that he could easily handle the famine, and he could easily handle the Pharaoh, if only Abram had just asked him first. Which brings us to part 4, our modern believer action guide: how to survive your own famines. So how do we actually take this rich ancient history and apply it to our lives today? We might not be dodging ancient Egyptian kings, but we all face our own versions of intense pressures and life crises. So here are 3 concrete actions for when you are under immense pressure. First, stop the drift. Remember, the text notes Abram gradually moved toward the south, into a spiritual borderland, before the famine even hit. You need to notice when you are slowly drifting away from your spiritual center. Second, don't rush to Egypt. When a crisis hits, resist that overwhelming urge to immediately grab the quickest, most worldly fix available. And third, wait on God. Let the trials and famines you face test and strengthen your obedience rather than allowing them to cause your spiritual downfall. To put that into daily practice, here are 3 concrete steps you can take literally today. Step 1, build personal altars of prayer. Just like Abraham did in Canaan, make sure you have a place and time dedicated to seeking God before the famine hits, so you know exactly whose voice to listen to when things get tough. Step 2, pitch your tent as a pilgrim. Don't get so attached to your current circumstances, your wealth, or your worldly comforts that you can't move when God calls. Keep your life flexible and totally focused on Him. And step 3, trust God's promises over self-preservation. When you're absolutely terrified, just remember that God's plan for you is far more secure than any half-truth or clever survival scheme you could ever invent. And that wraps up our explainer for today, but I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to really chew on as you go about your week. When the pressure is really on and your personal famine hits, are you going to build an altar right there in the middle of the struggle, or will you buy a one-way ticket to Egypt? Thanks so much for joining me today, and I really hope exploring this incredible journey helps you navigate whatever valley you might be facing right now.